Check out today's piece of OtakuDaiKun fan art. It's a rendering of me as a thief from Final Fantasy. I look quite greedy here, but I suppose that's just part of the business. Thank you so much, Mr. No One. Welcome back to OtakuDaiKun. Dai here. Next up in the lore of Fate Grand Order is Lostbelt 5.5, otherwise known as Heian-kyo, Naraka Mandala, Thunderous Flash. Unlike Imaginary Scramble, which took place prior to Atlantis, today's Singularity turned Lostbelt continues the story after Chaldea defeats the Olympus Lostbelt. Back then, our boy Scandinavia Peperoncino used his Shugendo Tengu arts to seal away Ashiya Douman's Shikigami clones, meaning that if we kill Douman one more time, that'll finally finish him off. If you like my content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Consider supporting the channel by becoming a member. We've got fun perks like early access, lessons in magecraft, and my manga series Living with My Own Gender Bend. This Singularity is both Douman's last stand, as well as a sequel of sorts to the Epic of Remnant, Shimosa. In Shimosa and here, he's trying to elevate a Singularity into a Lostbelt via a Holy Grail war. Back in Shimosa, he had heroic spirit swordmasters fight to the death in a gauntlet of sorts, and here he's holding a ritual called the Imperial Holy Grail War, which is filled with nothing but caster-class servants. After suffering humiliation during Olympus, Ashiya Douman retreated back to Japan's Heian period, specifically the year 1008 AD, around the time when the Genji clan was in service to the Emperor. The Genji's leader, Minamoto no Raiko, along with her 4 heavenly kings, protect Heian period Kyoto from Oni attacks. This also happens to be the period in which Ashiya Douman historically lived. This means that there are now 2 different Ashiya Doumans, the one from history, and the alter ego summoned by the alien god. I mentioned this way back, but it's worth reiterating that Ashiya Douman is an onmyoji, as well as the rival of Abe no Seimei, one of the world's greatest sages. Onmyodo is a type of Taoist magecraft that spread throughout Asia and became widely practiced in Japan. Abe no Seimei is the undisputed greatest onmyoji, and he too helps protect the capital through the use of a bounded field that surrounds the city. Both Seimei and Douman were part of the Bureau of Onmyo, serving the imperial court together. Of the two, Douman always felt inferior to Abe no Seimei, and in life, he eventually rebelled against the government while trying to defeat his rival. This means that the historic Ashiya Douman is harboring a lot of resentment that's just waiting to be provoked, and that's exactly what the servant version of Ashiya Douman, also known as the Caster of Limbo, does. Limbo contacts his historic self, and with but a single whisper, he corrupts the envious priest. Succumbing to hatred, Ashiya Douman merges with Limbo, and as a single villain, starts formulating a plan to fight back against Chaldea. So what exactly is this plan? Basically, he wants to gather enough mana so that he can transform the Singularity into a Lostbelt and become one of the beasts of humanity. That might have you wondering, what exactly is the difference between a Singularity and a Lostbelt again? Don't worry, I've got you covered. A Singularity is what you get when someone goes back in time and changes the history of an existing timeline. Rather than having a massive butterfly effect that changes the course of history immediately, the changes made instead form a bubble of sorts we call a Singularity. The more drastic the changes, the more that Singularity starts to encroach upon reality. There are plenty of small Singularities that hold no threat over history, and will resolve on their own, likely with help from the counterforce. When Chaldea needs to step in, that means the Singularity has grown big enough that it threatens to override history. When a Singularity gets resolved, the timeline goes back to normal. In this case, Limbo went back in time and corrupted his historical self, changing the course of history. This formed a Singularity that, if left unchecked, will threaten proper human history as we know it. Lostbelts work in a very similar way, but rather than being changes to a given timeline, they're actually separate parallel worlds that are trying to become the new proper human history. They are worlds that the universe decided to eliminate, but the alien god is keeping them alive with fantasy trees. Turns out, this is what Douman wants for his Singularity. By birthing his own fantasy tree, he thinks he can turn his Singularity into one of the Lostbelts. Whether you consider this an actual Lostbelt or just a Singularity with a giant alien tree is up to you, I suppose. Regardless, with the tree, he wants to make himself a beast of humanity, just like Koyenskaya is trying to do. In his case, since the alien god's current vessel, Yu Olga Marie, is insufficient, he believes he can make himself into a worthy vessel. Growing a fantasy tree isn't easy, though. It requires as much mana as it takes to reach the friggin' root. Abe no Seimei isn't actually around at this time, giving Ashiya Douman the chance to set up his own ritual called the Imperial Holy Grail War. It's similar to a standard Grail War, in which you exploit the Throne of Heroes to summon a bunch of servants, let those servants kill each other, and then collect the resulting mana for your own use. He gets the permission to conduct this ritual by convincing the capital's head honcho, Fujiwara no Michinaga, that it will help his clan and country flourish for thousands of years to come. Ashiya Douman makes it so that all the servants summoned for this war are other casters. Now, typically, casters tend to be supporters rather than attackers on the front line. This means that the casters sometimes let their own master do the fighting for them. Fittingly then, the criteria to be a master in this Imperial Holy Grail War is to be strong and powerful. This could mean being a brave warrior, but it can also be someone with tremendous influence, such as an author whose works go down in history. The most obvious candidates happen to be Raiko and her 4 Heavenly Kings. Lately, Raiko's been getting a lot of screen time, but this is where her story is most relevant. She was born as the daughter of a human and Oni. Specifically, she's the descendant of Gozu Tenno, the Japanese variant of Indra, the Hindu god of lightning. Originally named Ushi Gozen, Raiko was raised in secret because of her Oni blood until turning 15, at which point she was called back to the Minamoto clan as Minamoto no Raiko. Oh, and this confused me a bit at first, but the Minamoto clan and the Genji clan are the exact same thing, so feel free to use them interchangeably. Raiko went on to lead the clan despite her demonic aspect. At one point in the past, she tried to kill her Ushi-Gozen half, only for her general, Sakata Kintoki, to realize that killing Ushi-Gozen would also kill Raiko. The two are inextricably linked, thus Kintoki helped seal Ushi-Gozen away within Raiko, rather than slaying them. Ever since joining the Imperial Holy Grail War, Raiko has stayed secluded in the Genji clan's mansion. We met Kintoki way back in London, but yet again, this time period is more appropriate. Just like Raiko, he too has supernatural blood in him. His father was Raijin, another god of lightning who is also described as Japan's Red Dragon. Kintoki was raised by his mother, a cannibalistic mountain witch, on Mount Ashigara. As a child, he went by the name Kintaro, a folk hero who has many variations of his tale. In Fate's version of events, he stays on the mountain, living among animals with a beast-like strength of his own, until his mother is vanquished and he is entrusted to Raiko as a surrogate mother. She trains him to be one of her greatest warriors, and later on, he winds up being the one to reluctantly slay the Oni Shuten Douji, though it's worth noting that this singularity occurs before the kings raid Mount Oe. While the 4 Heavenly Kings are rough around the edges, Kintoki has a sense of old-fashioned chivalry when it comes to protecting women and children. Kintoki agrees to be part of the Imperial Holy Grail Wars, but for some reason he can't find his caster servant. The head of the 4 kings is a samurai named Watanabe no Tsuna. In his youth, Tsuna fell in love with the daughter of a noble family. He admired her from afar until, one day, she shut herself away in her home, never stepping out in public again. Rumors about the maiden spread, including one where she supposedly got pregnant. Tsuna tried to stay in touch, but eventually it was deemed inappropriate for a man like him to keep obsessing over a woman from outside his family. Thus, he took up the sword and began slaying monsters. Eventually, his skills were recognized by Raiko, and she appointed him head of the 4 kings while giving him the Genji's prized sword, Higekiri, or the Onikiri Yasutsuna, a blade which was used against Suzuka Gozen in the past. Unlike the other Heavenly Kings, Tsuna has a formal education from the Officers' Academy. This led him to investigating an Oni attack that took the life of the maiden he admired. Her throat was torn open, and a set of small, bloody footprints started from her body and continued throughout the house. Oni tend to devour humans, but in this case, the culprit only murdered its victims before escaping. Tsuna fights aggressively in the Imperial Holy Grail War after being convinced that the Grail's wish-granting properties might be able to resurrect the woman he loves. In that regard, he defeats the remaining 2 Heavenly Kings, Urabe no Suetake and Usui Sadamitsu, as well as their casters, forcing them to retire while their injuries heal. It's heavily implied that the small Oni that killed Tsuna's beloved is none other than Ibaraki Douji, the de facto leader of the Oni force stationed at Mount Oe. It seems the maiden was, in fact, pregnant with an Oni. When born, Ibaraki retaliated in a blind rage, slaughtering her mother and other victims before fleeing to the mountains. There, she became a high-ranked Oni, fierce and powerful enough to strike fear into the hearts of humans all across Japan. She doesn't seem to recall the circumstances of her birth, but it appears Tsuna is very much aware that Ibaraki is indeed the daughter of his beloved, and as such, he goes easy on her despite being an Oni slayer. Ibaraki looks up to Shuten Douji, whom she considers the strongest Oni on the mountain. However, Shuten has no interest in ruling over the other Oni, and passes that privilege on to Ibaraki instead. In the aftermath of this singularity, when the Heavenly Kings assault her lair, Ibaraki is the only Oni to survive. Speaking of Shuten Douji, we may have encountered her a lot by now in previous chapters, but this one takes her development to a new level. We already know Shuten is one of the 3 great monsters of Japan, alongside Tamamo no Mae and the Oni Otakemaru. Just like Kintoki, she too is the child of a dragon god. In her case, the kami of Mount Ibuki, Yamata no Orochi, is a serpent monster with 8 heads and 8 tails. Shuten is a self-indulging Oni who adores booze and banquets. She's got a bit of a thing for Kintoki, which is why, later in her life, she intentionally drinks poisoned sake that puts her and the other Oni of Mount Oe to sleep. She does it all for the sake of meeting Kintoki even once more. Again, though, this singularity occurs before that assault, but it's still worth mentioning since she at the moment has the hots for him. When I say Shuten Douji is the child of Yamata no Orochi, it's actually a bit more complicated. In Japan's Shinto religion, the gods, or kami, can separate themselves through a process called bunrei. It's basically taking a part of a god and worshipping it as a separate entity. Such is the case with Tamamo, who is the divided spirit of Amaterasu, and the same appears to be true for Shuten and Orochi. There are 2 aspects of her legend that go hand in hand. On one end, she is the incarnation of Orochi, a truly fearsome divine being tied to her father. On the other hand, we have the intoxicated, euphoric Shuten that we all know and love. They are, by all means, the same being, but it seems her more powerful aspect can be summoned independently. This aspect is Ibuki Douji, the snake-like Oni who more directly embodies her father's might. The Oni of Mount Oe look upon Shuten and can definitely sense her divine aura, but with Ibuki, it's all out on display. This isn't official, but I like to imagine Ibuki as a kind of Shuten Douji altar. The idea is very similar. We don't actually see Ibuki Douji until later in the story, but I wanted to mention her here while it's relevant. So far, everyone I've mentioned, meaning Raiko, Kintoki, Tsuna, Ibaraki, and Shuten, they're all themselves from history rather than servants. For once, they get to be the ones who have servants. Well, not Ibaraki, but the others. We don't know who Suetake and Sadamitsu summoned, but it hardly matters because both of them are out of the competition. Raiko's servant happens to be Nursery Rhyme. As Raiko puts it, she grew up on folk tales from her time. These stories were technically different than Western nursery rhymes like Humpty Dumpty, but they still count as nursery rhymes all the same. They were near and dear to Raiko in her youth, and in response to that, Nursery Rhyme the servant got summoned as her caster. One of Raiko's greatest wishes is to be a mother, and since Nursery Rhyme manifests as a child, she lets Raiko treat her as one, taking on a fitting disguise for the era. Instead of fighting in this war, Raiko and Nursery Rhyme hide out at the Genji estate so that no one can harm this newfound family. Rather than a mother, Nursery Rhyme just wants to be friends with Raiko, referring to her by her childhood name Monjumaru. Now technically, Raiko already has Kintoki as her son, but it's not quite the same considering he's a strong warrior capable of fending for himself. Watanabe no Tsuna's caster servant is Medea Lily. Thankfully, there's nothing new to cover regarding her, except that she takes a back seat in combat, using her magecraft to support Tsuna. While she doesn't know the details, she can sense the sorrow in Tsuna's heart, or rather, the woman he's always thinking about. She understands that sorrow, and does her best to help him throughout the war. Poor Kintoki doesn't have a caster yet, at least not that he knows of. Because of this, he just continues his duties as one of the 4 kings, helping to slay various monsters attacking the capital. Shuten Douji summons the caster servant Paracelsus von Hoenheim. Thanks to him, Shuten and the other Oni can slip past Abe no Seime's barrier around the city, even when they aren't at full strength. True to her wicked self, Shuten doesn't so much care for winning the Grail. Instead, she uses this chance to try and destroy the capital. More specifically, she and Hoenheim plan to reawaken Ushigozen from inside Raiko. It's also worth noting that this period in Japanese history features two prominent authors. The first is Sei Shounagon, an intelligent noble scholar who debated her male peers while being well versed in Chinese literature. She would go on to chronicle the royal court's activities into a compilation of essays and poems called the Pillow Book. At Chaldea, she's an archer servant, but this human version doesn't appear to have any special powers. She is, however, well aware of another of Japan's greatest writers, Murasaki Shikibu, author of the Tale of Genji. Murasaki, also known by the court as Lady Kaoruko, was born into a family of scholars, and even had the chance to train under Abe no Seimei to learn Onmyodo. She was never very good at it, only gaining control of such powers as a heroic spirit. Thus, the human version we meet here serves the court while trying to find inspiration for her writing. She's not a warrior, but because her writing is considered so influential, she is deemed powerful in a different sense, making her another master in the Imperial Grail War. Her servant is Charles Babbage, the King of Steam. It's been a while since London, so I'll remind you that, in life, Babbage was a scientist and mathematician who dreamed of making a better world. He used the power of steam to build the world's first computers, the difference in analytical engines. Sadly, he died before either of these devices could be truly completed. As a servant, he becomes the true embodiment of his dream, and he strives to protect Murasaki because he believes the tale of Genji is an embodiment of her dreams. Her wish for the Grail is to give her story the best ending possible. Despite being a master, she doesn't want to fight, and so she does her best to remain a pacifist so that no one suspects her. One of the rules Ashiya Douman put on this Holy Grail War is that servants are forbidden from taking spirit form for long periods at a time. As a result, Babbage stays at her home during the day, but at night, he travels to a cave behind the city's Inari Shrine. It's a great hiding spot, as mana ley lines intersect at the shrine, but it seems both Babbage and his helter-skelter minions are sometimes caught on the way there, sparking a rumor within the city that a giant armored suit can be found wandering the streets at night. Speaking of armored suits, recall that Sakata Kintoki was able to provide us with a powerful asset in the fight at Olympus. The Genji or Minamoto clan holds on to their favorite set of armor known as Setsu Armor Kumano, or Golden Huge Bear. When the machine gods in Greece lost their mechanical bodies in battle, part of that technology drifted across the ocean to Japan, where it was made into a suit of samurai armor. The Genji utilized this armor when slaying the great Tsuchigumo of Kitayama Rendai. Currently, Kintoki is the holder of the Setsu armor, but it's often too destructive for him to use on an ordinary foe. With that, we have all the masters and servants participating in Ashiya Douman's Imperial Holy Grail War. There's Raiko with her servant Nursery Rhyme, Tsuna with Medea Lily, Tsuetake and Sadamitsu with their respective servants, Shuten Douji with Hoenheim, and Murasaki Shikibu with Babbage. That's a total of 6 masters and servants, so what about the 7th? Kintoki is supposed to be the final master, but he doesn't have a servant. Abe no Seimei later says that Kintoki's servant is actually Limbo. This is technically true, but in form only. Because he is planning to offer himself up to the Grail, Ashiya Douman behaves as his own master, leaving Kintoki to essentially fill empty space in the roster. All of this disturbs history enough that Chaldea detects it as a threatening singularity not long after returning home from Olympus. Gordolf has been waiting for a luxurious director's office for a while now, but it's clear neither Nemo nor Sion have any intention of making that a priority. As nice as it would be to just zip on over to South America and kill the alien god while it's in an inferior vessel, we still wouldn't stand a chance at our current level. Sadly, Mashu's Black Barrel replica won't work on the alien god, since it only affects beings that can be defined by Earth's logic. Meanwhile, even in Olga's body, the alien god is capable of manipulating black holes with ease. Our only boon at the moment seems to be the data Kadek risked his life to obtain back in Olympus. This data finally clues in Chaldea to the fact that the alien god's first activities originated in Area 51. We can only take a small handful of servants along for the ray shift, and as much as our Kintoki wants to join, Da Vinci reasons it would be better not to have the historical Kintoki meet his servant form. Instead, we ray-shift with Mashu, Fuma Kotaro, and Robo-MILF Kato Danzo. The two ninja are desperate to get revenge on Ashiya Douman for all the crap he put them through in Shimosa. During the ray shift, however, it seems Douman sabotages the process, and to prevent a total failure, Kotaro sacrifices himself to save the others. This prevents Mashu and him from getting through, but it does create an opportunity for Ritsuka and Kato Danzo to slip in. Thus, we arrive in the capital's outskirts, where we're quickly attacked by monsters and lesser Tsuchigumo. Their sheer numbers prove to be a match for Danzo, and she gets injured. We're saved when Watanabe no Tsuna shows up and slays the remaining creatures. Only problem is, he's not really on our side. The moment he identifies that Ritsuka and Danzo are a master and servant, he comes to kill us. Just a moment prior to this, Tsuna was attacked by Ibaraki Douji on Ichijo Midoribashi. Rather than slaying Ibaraki altogether, he settled for slicing off her arm, claiming it as a souvenir. In actual history, this occurs much later, after the Heavenly Kings attack Mount Oe. In the Singularity, he warns Ibaraki not to come back, as right now, she has nothing to do with his goal of defeating the other masters. I assume this event happens earlier because, with Hoenheim's help, the Oni have an easier time getting into the city. Anyway, Tsuna tries to kill us, but Danzo gets us out of there with a smokescreen. We escape and run into Kintoki. Apparently, he isn't completely obsessed with the term golden yet, but we can fix that. Hell, it's almost like we were the ones who taught him that word. Mistaking us for helpless citizens in need, Kintoki protects us from Tsuna's attack. Tension rises, until Tsuna learns that Kato Danzo isn't even a caster servant, and therefore not really a participant in the war. Tsuna lets us go, but not before threatening to slay Kintoki if it turns out he has command spells. When we're safe, Kintoki tells us about the Imperial Holy Grail War, specifically that the court is cooperating with it because, supposedly, it was recommended by Abe no Seimei through a letter. Apparently, Ashiya Douman isn't persuasive enough, but Seimei, on the other hand, is considered trustworthy beyond measure. At first, Kintoki gets his hopes up, thinking that we're his caster servant, so we have to explain how we're a master from the future. All things considered, Kintoki is quite easygoing when we explain to him about Limbo and Chaldea. I guess when you've already accepted weird stuff like heroic spirits, you're more willing to humor other supernatural happenings. Heian-kyo is dangerous at night, so we need a place to stay. On the main road, we discover Sei Shounagon in her carriage. She insists we call her Lady Kyoko, and when we ask her for help, she hooks us up. We travel alongside her to the Murasaki Manor, where Shounagon assures us that Murasaki Shikibu will take us in for the night if we tell her that Kusa no Iori sends its regards. It's a cryptic message, as Kusa no Iori refers to a Chinese poem from Bai Juyi. Considering only fellow authors would get this reference, Murasaki is able to figure out that Shounagon sent us. As such, Murasaki kindly welcomes us into her home, though she insists we stop calling her by her pen name, and instead call her Kaoruko. Finally, with a chance to rest, Kato Danzo regains her full functionality, allowing contact with Chaldea. Mashu and Kotaro explain that they got cock-blocked from the ray shift, likely by Limbo. Da Vinci thinks the only reason we got in was because Ashiya Douman wanted us to come. This Grail War is suspicious, especially due to the fact that it only involves casters. They surmise there must be some trick behind it, but before they can figure it out, the call gets cut off, also thanks to Douman. Lady Kaoruko's household staff prepares us food in the morning, and as we eat, Danzo mentions hearing about a rumor. People have reported seeing a steel monster on the roads at night. For a moment, Kintoki worries we're talking about the Setsu Armor Kumano. Either way, after hearing our story, Kintoki agrees to help us put a stop to the Imperial Grail War, and reasons the fastest way to do that would be killing Limbo. Given the Onmyo Bureau is helping facilitate the war, we figure Ashiya Douman must be in the Imperial Palace, and since Kaoruko works at the palace, we ask her to take us along as guests. She gets us in early the next morning, where we run into someone rather curious. It's Tamamo no Mae, or at least it looks like her. Despite her claiming to be a woman named Lady Takako, Ritsuka can see her foxtails. Takako finds this alarming, and assumes that she and Ritsuka must have some kind of connection for her true form to be exposed like this. Otherwise, only Abe no Seimei should be able to see through her disguise. Still, we agree to pretend like nothing ever happened. By all means, Takako is a rather unimportant NPC during this chapter, yet her being here raises all sorts of questions. Mainly, is this supposed to be the historical Tamamo no Mae? As much as that would make sense, there are some inconsistencies. Historically, Tamamo no Mae decided to incarnate herself as a human child named Mizukume. When she was 18 years old, she joined the imperial court under Emperor Toba and eventually became the emperor's wife. She was happy like this until Abe no Seimei discovered her true form and exposed her as a monster. Tamamo fled the palace until she was eventually killed, turning into the famous Seisho Seki, or Killing Stone. Given that, it makes sense that Tamamo would be at the palace hiding her true form. However, we have to remember that this singularity occurs in 1008 AD. Emperor Toba didn't begin his reign until 1107, nearly 100 years later. For this to be the historical Tamamo, she would have had to be in disguise in the palace for over a century, which doesn't add up because, in her legend, Tamamo only became aware of her fox form 1 month before being exposed by Seimei. As for Seimei himself, him living for over a century isn't that hard to explain. As an onmyoji, he either had a mystical way of extending his life, or he's actually more than one person inheriting the name. The best explanation for all of this that I've come across posits that Tamamo incarnated as a human more than once. In this case, well before Mizukume, Tamamo incarnated as Fujiwara no Takako, the daughter of Fujiwara no Michikane. To support this idea, there are legends that claim Tamamo is the same monstrous being that committed atrocities in both China and India before coming to Japan. Specifically, she is associated with Daki during China's Yin dynasty and Baozi in the Zhou dynasty. Tamamo herself insists she has nothing to do with those figures, but Tamamo Cat, one of her tales, says otherwise. From this, I assume that Tamamo shapeshifted between her fox form and different other human forms throughout her existence, with each incarnation having separate memories. If this is true, it makes Tamamo one of the most complex heroic spirits in the Nasuverse, embodying several legends all at once. In this specific incarnation, she became Lady Takako after spending some years as a fox on Mount Ashigara, where she first met Kintoki in his youth. While Takako herself is never mentioned in later chapters, the upcoming Tunguska chapter gives a lot of credence to Tamamo's multiple incarnations. My current theory is that Tamamo incarnated as Daki, Baozi, Takako, and then Mizukume. It's crazy how this obscure cameo turned into such a rabbit hole, but I do like how it's developed her character. Before we find Ashiya Douman, he actually finds us. As much as we want to kill him, Kato Danzo can't sense the same malicious aura he had back in Shimosa. We fear that if this Douman isn't Limbo, but rather just the historical one, we shouldn't attack him. As such, Douman looks like the good guy when Fujiwara no Michinaga shows up and demands to know why we're at the palace. Unable to keep lying, Kintoki asserts his belief that the Imperial Holy Grail War is actually an evil scheme that will hurt Japan, not bring peace as they were led to believe. Problem is, we don't have any proof, and while Michinaga is surprisingly lenient, he won't call off the war without a good reason. He states that if the entire Genji clan could agree with Kintoki, maybe then he'll consider it. Dismissed from the palace, we hope to look for some proof of Douman's malicious scheme. At night, we investigate the rumor about that steel monster, and we discover a cave behind Inari Shrine that is filled with helter-skelters. We now know that Babbage is one of the casters, but we haven't yet figured out who his master is. Kaoruko sounds especially nervous when we discuss the helter-skelters with her, and the following night, she sneaks out of her manor to check on the shrine. Finding this suspicious, we follow Kaoruko to the cave. First, however, Shounagon appears to block our way. While she and Kaoruko don't know each other in person, Shounagon wants to protect Kaoruko, fearing us to be a threat. Apparently, she has a talisman given to her by Abe no Seimei, which she uses to summon monsters. They're no match for us, but luckily we have no intention of hurting anyone, and Shounagon decides to trust us. Inside the cave, we find Kaoruko and Babbage, but the big bucket of bolts isn't willing to listen to us. We calm him down and promise not to fight, but Watanabe no Tsuna shows up and ruins that pact. Babbage figures that fighting Tsuna is far too dangerous, and Kaoruko might get killed in the process. Thus, he instead chooses to duel Kintoki to the death. It becomes our very first match of the Holy Grail War, where we fight at the same blood-stained battlefield we used back in Shimosa. We defeat Babbage, causing him to be absorbed into the Grail. Luckily, Tsuna watches this and deems he has no reason to hurt Kaoruko now that she's out of the running. To the south, Shuten and Ibaraki Douji sneak past the bounded field around the city with Hoenheim's help. Without him, they'd only be able to sneak in once a month. Shuten gave Ibaraki a new replacement arm, which she uses to slaughter the guards. This ain't no pleasure cruise, though. Tonight, Shuten has work to do. When we show up to stop her, she has Ibaraki and the larger Oni Torakuma and Hoshikuma fight first. After that, Shuten herself shows off her command spells and gets Hoenheim to fight us with his homunculi. We push them back, and to escape, Shuten has Hoenheim teleport her to safety. The following morning, Kato Danzo shows us a map of the city and indicates where the Oni were headed during their attack. Initially, they all seem to be targeting Abe no Seimei's house, but it turns out that the Genji house, where Raiko lives, is just across the street. Since Raiko's heavenly kings were all chosen to be masters, it makes sense that Raiko herself would be too. To confirm this, we give her a visit and meet Nursery Rhyme, who's disguised as an ordinary girl. Initially, Raiko seems cold and scary, but the moment Kintoki stops acting tough and calls her mom, she warms up to everyone, happy to know that her son has new friends. While speaking with Raiko about the war, Tsuna comes along and criticizes Kintoki for going easy on the Oni. How precious, considering he did the same thing with Ibaraki. Still, despite a high level of security around the mansion, Shuten, Ibaraki, and Hoenheim show up again. Kintoki fights Shuten on the roof, while Ibaraki battles with Tsuna inside the house. Their true target is Raiko, and Ibaraki uses her fight with Tsuna to launch a surprise attack at Raiko's neck. In the nick of time, however, Nursery Rhyme jumps in and takes the hit, becoming mortally wounded. Surprisingly, clawing into an innocent girl like that traumatizes Ibaraki, likely bringing back some of her latent memories of when she killed her own mother. Turns out, this was according to Shuten's plan. She doesn't want Raiko dead, she wants her to go berserk, unleashing Ushi-Gozen. Horrified by Nursery Rhyme's injury, Raiko starts to lose control. Everyone can feel her divine aura, including Kintoki on the roof. Realizing we need to stop Raiko, Kintoki tosses Ritsuka back inside. There, Medea Lily is using her magecraft to try and heal Nursery Rhyme, but it has no effect. Ritsuka, on the other hand, uses their mystic code to heal, and it works enough for Nursery Rhyme to stand up and calm Raiko down. With her plan failed, Shuten Douji and Hoenheim battle Kintoki in an official bout of the Imperial Holy Grail War. Kintoki uses a devastating thunderbolt to shatter Hoenheim's spirit core, claiming victory. Before vanishing though, Hoenheim teleports Shuten back to Mount Oe. At first, Nursery Rhyme was on the verge of disappearing, but when Kintoki unleashed his lightning, it somehow stabilized her spirit origin. Since she is the embodiment of nursery rhymes, which include folktales, it seems Kintoki, acting true to his more famous anecdotes as Kintaro, helped her recover. With that settled, the Genji clan holds a meeting regarding the Grail War. Kintoki wants them to stop fighting, whereas Tsuna insists they continue. To settle the matter, Raiko approves an official duel between Tsuna and Kintoki, a battle to the death over their conflicting wills. At the Imperial Deathmatch stage, we have a really fucking annoying fight against Tsuna. Despite using the deathmatch stage, Tsuna forbids Medea Lily from helping him. She reminds him too much of the woman he once loved, and doesn't want her to get hurt. Instead, Kintoki and Tsuna work out their differences through combat, and Kintoki is declared the winner when Tsuna admits defeat. Originally, Tsuna wanted to win the Grail to resurrect the woman he lost, but he's convinced that doing that now would be both wrong and impossible. As the victor, Kintoki has Raiko and the other Genji members agree to oppose the war. This news reaches Michinaga, who, true to his word, calls off the war. Unfortunately, Ashiya Douman refuses to accept this, finally showing his true colors. He admits he's been limbo for some time now, before obliterating the other Onmyoji with a single curse. Giving himself an ego boost, he declares he is now Oban Ashiya Douman, an Onmyodo god seeking to establish Naraka Mandala, a Buddhist realm of hell. According to Onmyodo belief, the mandala is a compass of sorts, a calendar with 8 directions, attributed to 8 separate godly generals called the Hashojin. This is his plan B, to make himself one of the Hashojin and summon the other 7 as additional servants. He prematurely awakens his fantasy tree with only 4 heroic spirits collected so far. 2 of them came from the other heavenly kings, and then we defeated Babbage and Hoenheim, accidentally contributing to Douman's scheme. Even with only 4, his fantasy tree turns the moon red, inciting a permanent night. The Hashojin are summoned in pairs to the outskirts of the city, specifically the Rashomon Gate, and by having all of them gather at Suzaku Gate, where the tree is, Douman hopes to collect the rest of the mana needed to complete his pseudo-Lostbelt. Honestly, we should have just killed him when we had the chance. Now, rather than summoning the Hashojin directly, Douman instead summons other Japanese servants and forces them to play the role of Hashojin. The first 2, Saisetsu and Hyobi, are summoned into the Saint Grafs of Tawara Tota and Suzuka Gozen respectively. We're still at the Genji house when this happens. Before we go to face the Hashojin, Kaoroko shows up with a letter from Abe no Seimei. It's no ordinary letter, but rather a catalyst for long-form communication. Through floating text, Abe no Seimei explains that he knows all about the situation by monitoring his bounded field and has devised a method of stopping Ashiya Douman's plan. The main problem is that Douman needs the mana from 7 heroic spirits to complete his damn tree, which means he only needs 3 more. We can't just go kill his Hashojin, because if we do, the tree will just absorb them when they vanish. I assume Abe no Seimei has clairvoyance, because he claims he saw this coming, and has crafted a set of 8 Taizan talismans that, if applied to defeated servants, will prevent their souls from being absorbed. At Suzaku Avenue, we confront Tawara and Suzuka. They struggle against their Hashojin influence, which brings out their lust for combat. The 2 of them both have projectile-based noble phantasms, preventing our party from landing a hit. During their duel to the death, Tsuna and Raiko stake their bets on the brief moment before Tawara and Suzuka can invoke their noble phantasms. They wait for that exact moment and slay the 2 Hashojin in a single strike. Ritsuka seals their souls, putting a temporary end to their threat. Douman doesn't seem to be able to summon more than 2 Hashojin at a time, so for his next pair, he brings out the great Tsuchigumo Kugamini no Mikasa as the Hashojin Saiha, and Taira no Kagekiyo as the Hashojin Saikyo. Kugamimi is the giant spider that ruled over Mount Oe long before Shuten and Ibaraki took over. As for Kagekiyo, she's a bit trickier to explain. In history, the Minamoto or Genji clan fought against the Taira clan for control over the nation. These battles are documented in the Tale of the Heike, which describes a samurai from the Taira who fought and died in the Genpei War, only to become a malevolent spirit that seeks vengeance upon Minamoto no Yoritomo. Legendarily, Kagekiyo becomes known as a manifestation of the Taira's hatred of the Genji, allowing any warrior with a grudge against the Genji to manifest as him. Oddly enough, one of the warriors with the greatest hatred of the Genji happens to be Minamoto no Yoshitsune, our beloved Ushi-Wakamaru. I covered her back in Babylonia, but Ushi-Wakamaru became a Genji commander who was hopelessly loyal to her brother, Yoritomo, the very same guy that Kagekiyo holds a grudge against. She adored her brother, fighting for his sake like a dog in order to defeat the Taira. Yoritomo, however, looked upon his sister as though she were an inhuman monster, a violent being who couldn't grasp her own humanity after being trained by a Tengu. More specifically, she never feared the battlefield, making Yoritomo fear her. As such, when the Genji prevailed over the Taira, Yoritomo saw Ushi-Wakamaru as a threat and betrayed her. She fled to Oshu with her subordinates, but Yoritomo's men hunted her down and killed her. Needless to say, that betrayal left Ushi-Wakamaru with a profound hatred for the Genji, which is why Taira no Kagekiyo is summoned into her body. Known in legend as the Genji Killer, she naturally has an overwhelming advantage against Genji soldiers. The Genji who approach her feel a strong compulsion to surrender, letting her behead them with ease. Since our party mostly consists of Genji heroes, we decide not to rush in without a plan. Luckily, Taira no Kagekiyo isn't in a hurry to reach Suzaku Gate. Instead, she's lingering around Kamogawa Bridge. This gives us time to recruit more help, but the only other strong fighters around happen to be the Oni on Mount Oe. Thus, we take a hike up the mountain, hoping to convince the Oni to temporarily join us. After all, they can't destroy Heian-kyo if Douman does it first. Kintoki and Shuten see each other as kindred spirits with a strong chemistry, and this gives Kintoki an edge in recruiting the intoxicated Oni. Ibaraki refuses adamantly, but Shuten agrees to help us, mostly for her own amusement. Kagekiyo doesn't really understand her fascination with Kamogawa Bridge, but her Ushi-Wakamaru side certainly does. This is where Ushi first met and fought her most famous retainer, Musashibo Benkei. Since we know all about Ushiwakamaru's legend, we teach Kintoki all about her, hoping to exploit her feelings. Thus, when we fight Kagekiyo, Kintoki decides to impersonate Benkei, reciting famous lines from legend. Angered by this provocation, Kagekiyo has Kugamimi no Mikasa attack the party, while intoxicating us with an anti-Genji poison. To counteract this poison, Douji releases waves of her wine, allowing Kintoki to continue the fight. Resuming his act as Benkei, Kintoki brings out Kagekiyo's Ushiwakamaru persona, and while they duel at the Imperial Deathmatch stage, he helps her realize why she picked up the sword. Remembering her ideals as a Genji warrior, Ushiwakamaru's hatred of the clan dwindles, allowing Kintoki to claim victory. Kagekiyo is defeated, but she feels a sense of relief in being able to recall her inspiration. Her brother may have betrayed her, but Ushiwakamaru still fought honorably as a Genji warrior. Once more, as she vanishes, Ritsuka uses a talisman to preserve her soul. Kintoki expected to die from this fight, infected by the Genji poison emanating from Kagekiyo, but with his opponent gone, the poison's effect vanishes too. With 4 of his precious Hashojin defeated, Ashiya Douman changes tactics yet again. Now, he wants to use Yamata no Orochi as a vessel to become a beast of humanity. Thus, he summons Ibuki Douji, Orochi's incarnation, who proceeds to strike fear into Ibaraki and the other Oni. They are all compelled to serve her as she descends the mountains and heads for the gate. At a major standoff, Raiko, Tsuna, Kintoki, and Douji all fight against the demon horde. But when Ibuki Douji herself makes an appearance, no one is strong enough to defeat her, not even Shuten, who is an aspect of Ibuki. She wields her noble phantasm, a sacred sword known as Kusanagi no Tachi. In legend, Kusanagi is one of Japan's 3 sacred treasures, and it was literally found inside one of Yamata no Orochi's tails when Susanoo defeated it to save Kushinada Hime. As an incarnation of Orochi, Ibuki can use this sword that came from her father's body, even though she's unable to tap into its true power. Even just a fraction of that power is enough to subdue the party. While Ibuki Douji crushes us under a strong gravitational force, Ashiya Douman has another realization. Turns out, he can complete his tree by sacrificing the aspects that compose him as a high servant. You see, Ashiya Douman is just one aspect of the caster of Limbo. When the alien god summoned him as an alter ego, he compounded himself with other pieces, namely the Aztec goddess Ispapalotl, the Slavic Chernobog, and the vengeful Japanese spirit Safu. By sacrificing them, Douman is just barely able to complete his fantasy tree, and it blooms in the center of Heian-kyo. Changing his name yet again, he calls himself the Rakshasa King, Skull Eboshi Ashiya Douman. He gets impatient, calling Ibuki Douji over to Suzaku Gate to become a beast, even if it means sparing us. At the gate, Ibuki meets with Ashiya Douman while we give chase, fighting the fantasy tree's seeds along the way. We catch up, only to see Douman betray Ibuki. Originally, he did plan to use her as a beast vessel, but after thinking it over and realizing how annoying Lostbelt kings can be, he decides to have the tree absorb her so that he can become a beast directly. Too bad he's an idiot, and his new plan has a giant, glaring hole. Beasts of humanity, while considered enemies of humanity that the counterforce wants to defeat, ironically carry with them a love for humanity. Thus, they're not evil due to their intentions, but rather the way they act on those intentions. Getia, for instance, wanted to destroy humanity as we know it to create an ideal version of humanity that doesn't have the concept of death. Tiamat, in her rampage, still saw humans as her beloved children. Even Koyenskaya, who is attempting to ascend as the new Beast 4 after Foe stepped down, must also have some love in her heart for humans. Ashiya Douman, at least the one summoned as an alter ego by the alien god, does not. When Seimei points this fallacy out, Douman resorts to using his completed tree to devour the whole damn singularity. With an enemy this dangerous, Kintoki finally calls down the Setsu armor, Golden Huge Bear, and dons it to protect the people he loves. Inspired by a speech Babbage gave about following one's dreams, Kintoki yearns to be a hero, and responding to his resolve, Ibuki calls out to him. She's still inside the tree, and maintains enough self-control to release her sword for him to use. Becoming an epic lumberjack, Kintoki wields both the Setsu armor and Kusanagi sword to chop down this tree. In one final battle against Ashiya Douman, we push him to the edge, and he tries to weasel his way out of death by offering to sell out the alien god's secrets. At this point, though, we're just sick of his shit, so Ritsuka orders an all-out attack, using command spells to power up Kintoki. Danzo, Raiko, Shuten, Ibaraki, and Tsuna all slay Douman before he can retaliate. In unison, both the tree and Limbo are put to death. In the aftermath, Heian-kyo begins to correct itself like any other singularity. Nursery Rhyme and Medea Lily bid us farewell, reminding Kintoki that he still has no clue who his caster is. Abe no Seimei reasons that, since Douman was both his own master and servant, Kintoki kinda wound up as an 8th master without a servant. That explanation doesn't satisfy him though, so Kintoki ignorantly reasons that even though Ritsuka is a human master from Chaldea, they must be his servant. Whatever, bro. If it makes you happy to think that way, I guess. We leave the singularity with an emergency ray shift, after telling Kintoki that while he won't remember this adventure, we'll still be reunited with him when he's a heroic spirit. Despite obliterating the caster of Limbo, it seems the human Ashiya Douman that Limbo was manipulating was able to survive the ordeal. This is the original Douman, the jealous loser who allowed hatred into his heart due to the thought that he may never be strong enough to match Abe no Seimei. Fearing he'll one day turn into a villain like Limbo, he tries to take his own life, only for Abe no Seimei to finally show up in person and stop him. We still don't get to see Seimei, nor do we learn what he's been up to all this time, but I suppose it's a bit touching how he has some compassion for his idiot rival. With Heian-kyo complete, we're finally all clear to head into Lostbelt 6, Avalon Le Fay, which, at the time of making this video, is the longest and most important chapter in FGO. I'm so excited to stream it with you guys when it hits North America. I hope you look forward to it. Thanks for watching!
If you enjoy this channel, help us grow by liking, commenting, sharing the video, subscribing to OtakuDaiKun, and
most of all, smashing that notification bell so you don't miss out on all of our anime discussion, lore, or Let's Play content.
You can support us directly through Patreon, Subscribestar, or our YouTube membership, all of which come with benefits like exclusive vids and early access.
As always,
celebrate your fandom!
I want to give a special shout out to all my $10 and up supporters. VideoGamer75, Stephen Elak, Samuel Gersten, The Nonchalant Ostrich, Otaku Mom, Jens Bauman, Mystic Samurai 1983, Lord Omagoden, Freebrick, RNG Shuffles 1498, Alexis Yukio Gomez Yamato, Link Pendrago, Observer Bellis, Flash Daniel, Hilden Yarbrough, Horseman of Justices, James Hewitt, Uncanny EXP, Matthew McAfee, Game King 352, Caitlin P., Vladimir Rovna, Succubus Sakura, Normace, Jonathan Padua, The Taz 96, President Irna Vladimirovna Putina, Maxwell's Demon, and SF Giants fan Mike. Thank you all so much.